I'll just say that this is the first year in 3 years where it's not a global pandemic. And this is the first year where we feel as if we're going to go in to a cycle and have, thoughtful plans in place to help implement. Because before it was, you're dealing with the global pandemic, nobody what's going on, you have to figure it out. You're dealing with Supreme Court decisions that you have to figure out. This is the first year where it's kind of a clean slate.
That's Washington State Senator Joe Nguyen, and coming up, we're going to talk to him about the upcoming legislative session that kicks off in January 8th, 2024. Welcome, everybody, to Chino y Chicano.
I'm Matt Chan, the Chino.
I'm Enrique Cerna, the Chicano. Well, Matt, this is someone that you know well because you actually helped him get elected. What was that, back in 2019 that you helped run his campaign?
Oh, ancient history. Yeah, it's been a while. He was one of the first campaigns I ever did. I mean, I was approached, said, do you want to help this guy? And I saw his picture and I go, yeah, okay, he's an Asian guy. I'll do this. So I met him and I really thought he was thoughtful. He was smart. I mean, I thought he's the future of politics.
Yeah.
And it's always good to help someone of color achieve office.
And his background is in technology, right?
Yes.
And business.
And business.
Like yeah. He's an interesting guy because he's in the 34th Legislative District, which includes White Center, West Seattle, Vashon Island, and part of Burien. And he actually grew up there, and his family he still lives in West Seattle. He's the chair of the Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee. He's also, I think, the vice chair on the Ways and Means Committee, and that has a lot to do with the budget. And I think at one point, too, he was the Democratic Assistant Floor Leader. So he's a young guy, a millennial, and he's got a lot of energy. And coming up this session, he's going to be very busy because he's part of the budget writing team.
Yeah, he's always busy. I mean, he's one of those guys who is really capable. And I think we need more people like Joe in the legislature. And that's why, I'm so happy he's joining us to give us sort of a preview of what the upcoming session is going to be like and what's important to the state.
Well, I think the other thing we want to talk to him about is just what's it like being a legislator in Olympia when you come from a background like where he grew up, and then you come in and, you're going to be accepted. There's a certain amount of traditions there. He's a young guy with a technology background. They're going to accept him. And so he's got some interesting stories in telling us all about that, as well as some of the issues that our state is facing in this next legislative session. Here now is our conversation with Washington State Senator Joe Nguyen. State Senator Joe Nguyen, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. We appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, we're short time away from the legislative session starting, January 8th, 2024. Let's talk a little bit about what your role is going to be in this upcoming session, because you have a couple of positions. And how is Joe Nguyen going to be handling these different positions and trying to be in the same place at the same time and all that stuff?
No, well, I'll say it is interesting going from 5 years ago when I first ran for office, and Matt Chan obviously is one of my mentors and people that have helped me kind of in this space, to go from being the outsider where, we had establishment folks saying, we don't want you here, to now I'm the chair of the Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee, which in Washington State, it's a pretty big committee. And then I'm also the vice chair of Ways and Means. So I help write the budget for Washington. I'm one of two people in the Senate that write the budget for Washington State. And being able to have that level of responsibility is a tremendous honor, but it is a lot of work.
So has anybody held that position before? I mean, being vice chair.
So I had my staff told me that they've never seen, and they look back, there's never been anybody that's been a vice chair of Ways and Means, which in itself is a lot of work, right? You do meetings from basically 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. at night, and then also be chair of a major committee. So when this kind of first happened, there were definitely folks who were nervous about being able to balance the two, but it's an important position to be in. But no, I don't think anybody's been both before in the history of Washington State.
Wow.
So So having this past session, I mean, a lot of stuff got done, but what are we looking forward to this coming year? I mean, what are the priorities that people will really recognize and will affect them personally? I mean, there's a lot of
Yeah.
procedural stuff, but what is the kind of stuff people are going to feel?
Yeah. I think first off, what I will say is in terms of the legislature versus local jurisdictions, I found, and a lot of folks have found, that people don't necessarily differentiate between what's happening in Seattle or King County versus the state. Everybody sees it kind of all as one big mix of government. And oftentimes the things that we do are more high level, right? We set rules that then everybody else has to follow. We set tax policy that everybody else has to follow. We don't necessarily implement work in terms of on the ground as it relates to public safety or criminal justice, but we can help guide some of those conversations. And what's interesting is that in Washington State last year, 95% of the bills that we passed, 95% were actually bipartisan, meaning the vast majority of the work that we do is actually non-controversial, very cordial for the most part. That last 5% is kind of what you would expect, where you'd find some division versus Democrats and Republicans. So long story short, I'll just say that this is the first year in 3 years where it's not a global pandemic. And this is the first year where we feel as if we're going to go in to a cycle and have, thoughtful plans in place to help implement. Because before it was, you're dealing with a global pandemic, nobody what's going on, you have to figure it out. You're dealing with Supreme Court decisions that you have to figure out. This is the first year where it's kind of a clean slate.
How was that during COVID with, because you can't really be together and you have to do it a lot of times over Zoom. I mean, we all know that it just, changed everything. So talk about that, about how that was versus, being able to be back with people as you have been able to be.
There's pros and there's cons when it relates to the pandemic with COVID specifically. Obviously, that was a horrific opportunity, a horrific time for a lot of folks that we had to kind of manage through. But it actually opened up government in a way that hadn't been done before. When I first came in, I advocated for having remote testimony because a lot of times when you have to physically get down to Olympia, it's prohibitive. So the people who are most impacted by policy don't then participate because they can't take a whole day off during the week to drive down for a committee hearing and speak for 90 seconds after they just spent all day getting to Olympia. So because we had access to Zoom and other technology that gave people the ability to give feedback, I actually think representation became better. The downside is a lot of the conversations are happening with members, with stakeholders, with analysts, with advocates. Those kind of got lost a little bit because they happened so fast, where if you had to make a decision, if you had to get information, you would have to try to coordinate and find folks and get them online versus if you're down there, you can talk to a member right away. So, there's pros and there's cons. I think it was great in general for the greater community. It was difficult during the pandemic. I had to personally teach countless members how to use their computers just because I'm one of 3 millennials, I think, in the Senate. But that helped me because I think that helped me build some credibility and trust within my own caucus. So I will say being in person for a session, much easier, much more effective, but also having that ability for testimony to come remote, I think that's been transformative for our democracy.
Yeah, it's kind of a legacy that you get a lot done in the hallways, don't you?
And that's just the case. Yeah.
Well, it's a personal thing. It's just almost like you're networking. When you're with somebody in front. You said something earlier that I found interesting, and I want you to talk a bit about something about when you first came there and people didn't want you, or is it like
didn't want you
getting into the club or what?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, again, Matt knows this because he was there with me. But when we were first running for office, the things that I was told, not to run, you can't do this, you don't belong here, all these things that basically try to minimize your experience, right? I'm a young person of color from the White Center area. I get to serve the community where I was born and raised. It's a very diverse community because it includes White Center, yet I'm the first person of color to ever represent the 34th district in the legislature. And I didn't have a political background. I didn't work in politics. I never staffed anybody. I just cared and I showed up. So when I first ran for office, I had very little support, yet despite that, I was able to win by 18%. So when I came in, the first year and a half was interesting because half the people either hated me or they were scared because I was this new kid on the block. But it wasn't anything that I did. It was just because I was different. When I say different, in my office, if you ever come down to Olympia, all the senators have, grandiose offices, mahogany desks, heavy drapes on the windows. The senators in this big room, everybody else is in this little room. There's interns blocking your way. Like, it's made to provide a certain ethos. I took out all the furniture. I just, when I saw it, I said, this is not conducive to positive conversations. I took out all the furniture. I took the small office. I gave my staff the big office. They're basically co-working areas. The entrance to when you get to my office, it's effectively a tech break room, right? Like, there's snacks, there's an espresso machine, there's an Xbox, there's a TV. I play calm music. So when people come in, they're very calm, and people freaked out. I mean, I had lobbyists freak out. I had members freak out. I put iPad outside so you can check in easier. People were like, you're not allowed to do that stuff. So it was kind of an interesting dynamic to go into the legislature and feel completely foreign. And then, I think what's been interesting is, for me at least, I care about the work and I care about outcomes, which I find not everybody is in that camp. Yeah. So because I built a reputation for working hard, for building coalitions, and for having thoughtful conversations, it's been a bit different over the last couple of years.
Well, the non-traditional thing. So that's hard to probably, let's face it, you're talking about places that have their way of doing things. So what was the deal with the iPad? What was the deal with the iPad?
Just when you check in, it's so busy that you try to collect everybody's information and stuff like that. So I had an iPad where you can type in your information. That way I can contact you later. And then I also use a tool called Calendly. It's an app to schedule my meetings. So the same way that you schedule a haircut, that's how I schedule my meetings. And people just freaked out. But the interesting thing about that is I would have folks send their materials in advance. Everybody, when they meet with you, you meet in 15-minute increments. So my day starts at about 6. It doesn't end till about midnight or 1, and everything is scheduled in 15-minute increments. So what happens most of the times is people come in, they are nervous, and then they have the members start to read their thing. And by the time they get to a conversation, the meeting is over because you have 50 minutes. So what I do is I have them send my materials in advance. The night before, my staff puts it all together for me. I read it in advance. When they get there, they're usually a little bit early. And because they're in what looks like a living room, and because they're watching, it's called Moving Art on Netflix, and because they have snacks, it's very comfortable. So by the time that they come into my office to speak to me, and my office is very approachable. It looks like a podcast station. I mean, like you walk in and I have my monitors and a light. So everybody is already calm. I already know their topic. So we skip the whole like me learning about it, and I ask questions and then we move on. And I thought that was what you should do. Apparently it's not. And then because of that, I kind of built this reputation for knowing all the topics, which is not actually true. I just read in advance.
So has anybody else adopted your style?
Yeah. I don't know if anybody's done it full Joe Nguyen in terms of modifying their topics. But everybody basically uses Calendly now, because before your staff would spend probably 80% of their time just coordinating calendars.
Yeah.
Now that they don't have to do that, they can do other things. So mine does constituent outreach. They do communications with folks in the district. They help me with policy. So effectively, I've been able to utilize my staff for value add and not necessarily busy work. And that's why I have those two positions. People say, how do you do both? Well, I use technology in a way that nobody else does. And I don't.
Well, you're organized.
Yeah. Very organized. So you can do both.
So I've got a question, because in Seattle, right? I mean, there's a will to do a lot of stuff like gun control, income tax. Yeah. And the line always comes back, well, we can't do it because of the state.
I know.
What's that about? What's that about? Why does the state hold so much power over the counties in that sense?
That's how our Constitution works.
Yes.
Yeah. The cities and the counties, that is 100% true. The state grants the authority for local jurisdictions to do things. And you'll hear a lot about unfunded mandates. You hear a lot about obligations of the state. You hear a lot about our hands are tied. there's just to be very candid, because we're amongst friends and anybody who is listening, some of that is bullshit where they just don't want to do it and they blame the state. What's interesting to me, what I get a little bit frustrated by, some of the folks who are the most vocal about how the state handcuffs them in certain ways, they were in the legislature when it happened. So right now, there's a movement to lift the 1% cap so that we can raise more revenue in our counties. And the people who were in the legislature when it happened, whether they supported it or not, never fixed it. And now I have to come in and fix people's problems from 30 years ago. So there's a dynamic that kind of exists there too. But that's the way that our Constitution works, is the state sets the parameters in which local jurisdictions are allowed to engage. And then from there, they can do some of that work. So there is some of that duality that exists. And then the hard part oftentimes is what Seattle might want isn't what everybody else wants. So you then have to figure out that line, because even if, we want to do it for our communities, maybe somebody else doesn't want it. So there's kind of that battle as well. But that's an ongoing fight.
For example, one of the things is gun control, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Because the violent crime rate in Seattle is so high right now, and the homicides are so high, it screams out for a level of gun control. Yeah. But they can't get it through. I think if you put that on the ballot, it would pass in Seattle.
In Seattle, but yes. So that one is a particular concern as well. So I'm very passionate about gun control and ensuring that we prevent gun violence in any way possible. I think in terms of how we do that, there needs to be a coordinated way for us to move forward, right? So I think that this legislature, because of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility and efforts that have been done in the last 5 years, it is much more progressive on gun violence than it's ever been historically as well. I think part of it is the way that we approach problems. So just taking a step back in general, not necessarily just on gun policy, but as a whole, oftentimes folks don't realize that when you campaign in poetry. It's high level, it's talking points, you have to win hearts and minds. When you govern in prose, right? It's very technical, it's policy, it's very wonky, it's very detailed. So we have to then transition from saying, give the cities the ability to regulate guns to this is how we want cities to regulate guns. And I think that's kind of the disconnect that's happening right now. A lot of the focus has been on, training around PURPA laws, so the red flag order protection laws, and around assault weapons and high capacity magazines. All great things, all things that I supported. But if you look at gun violence specifically, you look at just gun deaths as a whole, it's not actually that. It's suicide, it's handguns, it's things like that. So we have to have a more robust kind of framework in terms of how do we address it. I'm actually going to meet with the mayor to chat about it later today.
The one of the big issues that is also, I think, the legislature has had to face and will continue to face, and may again go to the vote of the people, is the whole issue of police and how far they can go, like chasing a criminal and that type of thing. And then you have a disconnect. You're a West Side guy. Now, I grew up in Central Washington, and it's, so how do you talk about that and the balancing of dealing with your comrades, or not comrades, your colleagues on the Central and Eastern
Washington?
It
could be now.
That's kind of true. That's kind of true. Oh, anyway.
and that, when you talk about the gun violence prevention and gun control policies as a whole, that's actually it, right? So oftentimes in Seattle, for me, we live in our bubble and we have our constituents, we have our stakeholders that we work with, and you have a completely opposite paradigm when it comes to Central and Eastern Washington. What's funny is one of the biggest pet peeves that I found for folks who don't live in Western Washington or Puget Sound, if you call Eastern Washington when you really mean Central Washington,
right? But they don't know the difference. Yeah, they don't know the difference. Yeah, like I grew up in Wapato, in Yakima's, right? That's Central Washington.
That's Central.
When you're talking about Spokane and all of that area, now that's Eastern.
That's Eastern.
Yeah.
So the number of people that I've seen fall into that trap is very high.
Yeah.
So part of it is how do you balance that? How do you push on very forward, progressive policies and ensuring that folks there are also included? what I will say is, me personally, I try to spend more time talking to folks that I disagree with than folks that I agree with, because I think you learn a lot more when you kind of get out of your bubble a little bit. And what I found too, oftentimes, is if you look at policies or a bill or a budget priority, if you only talk to the people that agree with you, and you finally get into that room, that budget room or the policy room or the committee or the hearing, and you've not talked to anybody else, and then somebody says, hey, what about X, Y, Z? And they're valid points, but you just didn't talk to them, the bill dies, right? So it's actually advantageous for us to not necessarily reach across the aisle because we have to, but because it does make the policy better. And even if you disagree with them, I think that actually helps. So that's kind of the balancing act. I end up driving a lot around Washington State for a lot of the work that I do, because oftentimes some of the members who represent Central and Eastern Washington, they're there for a particular reason. They're there because they hate government, or they're there because they're espousing certain values, and they've kind of focused on those things, which that's not, their voters voted, so it's not up to me. But I do go out and I speak with folks around energy policy, around basic needs, around investments, around criminal justice, to see how we can better help support those things too. And I think part of it is, in government, we need folks who are willing to do that selfless work, that kind of behind the scenes. You'll never get notoriety associated with it. It's not going to win you re-elections, but it does make you a good legislator. I think that's kind of what we need to foster more of in Washington State.
Yeah. So what's it like when you go to a place like where I grew up in Yakima Valley, or or to what is Eastern Washington, like Ritzville, where Mark Chesler is the state senator and has a strong reputation, which last year I did the, I'm in the Board of Regents at WSU. So we did Regents and Trustees Day. And so we went to Chesler's office, which was interesting because he has this dog. What's his dog's name? Colt or something? I can't remember. And the dog greets you at the door. And he's just like, he wants you to pet him and all this. And then, walk into his office, and of course he's got, all of his stuff in there. The deer. Yeah. The animal heads up there.
So funny story. Chesler and I have a decent relationship, and we were actually very cordial in my first year. Part of it was because of his dog. I think when I came in, I came in very hot. So I was mad at not just Republicans. I was mad at Democrats too. And I said, we all can do better. And whatever I said resonated with him. So he invited me to his office to hang out for a little bit. He gave me some summer sausage. So he had just gone hunting, made sausage out of venison or whatever it was. Yeah. And then it's me, him, and like 5 Republicans in his office, which is kind of when I walked in, his staff kind of like froze up. They weren't sure why I was there. So I sat down. His dog walks around the room for a little bit, looks at me, sits at my feet, and just stays there the entire time. And from that moment on, Mark and I have been like good, because I'm good with his dog. But what I will say, it's so funny. We were sitting. So speaking of Mark Chesler, we were sitting on the couches on the Senate floor. There's couches in the back, and we were sitting there and chatting. And he was talking about how he's on Medicare, and how he's part of the utilities co-op, the electric co-op. And I said, you're a socialist, right? Like, you're on government healthcare, and you have a co-op for utilities. You're a socialist. He's like, yeah. Right. So it's interesting where, and did you know him? That's actually, he's very conservative. And part of that is, if you take the time to kind of get past some of those divisions that we have and focus on the things that actually help people, it kind of breaks the ice. Obviously, his personality is abrasive, and it kind of rubs some people the wrong way. But I think me coming in also being a little bit abrasive, he probably thought that was like an interesting dynamic. But for me, when I go to those places, I think humility goes a long way. I think a lot of times when I see problems with kind of the communication between the Puget Sound corridor and everybody else, is that there's a level of arrogance when it comes to folks who come from the Puget Sound as it comes to what their beliefs are for Washington State. And I say that like in the most, that's just a factual statement, right? We think that because we're Seattle, we do it a certain way, and everybody else should do that way as well. Yeah. Which, I'm from Seattle. I don't think that we're wrong, but how we approach it, could be a lot better. And I think when I go,
you bring up a great point, because it's almost like, if you go to the U and you go to WSU, there's this kind of, like Those guys think
There's
they're better,
tension.
better than us. Yes. And having
Yeah.
grown up in central Washington and then gone to school in eastern Washington, you know, there is a sense, I think, of people over there feeling like, you know, the West Side looks down on us.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear what you do to kind of break that down. I kind of wonder,
sort of human nature, though.
Right.
It's human. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are other lawmakers doing the same, I guess, from Seattle?
Well, you know, it's interesting because recently, this past month, we spoke to Representatives Adam Smith and Marilyn Strickland. And we of course, we asked them about the dysfunction in Congress. Do we have something similar to that in Washington? Because it's really, they said, it really is just a handful, like 7 people that gum up the entire works.
That Marilyn Strickland talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. A handful of people. So, for the most part, are, you know, the two parties collegial in the Washington legislature, or is it just some bad actors, or is there hope, is what I'm saying, of getting stuff done?
No, people are shocked. So in Washington State, it's actually very cordial, at least in my experience over the last 5 years, going on 6 at this point. Like I mentioned, the vast majority, 95% of our bills were bipartisan. You know, I love my wife. We're life partners. I don't think that I agree with her 95% of the time, right? So, like, this is actually not a bad.
Well, that's called marriage, Joe.
It's called marriage. Yeah. So it's actually very cordial. And as an example, I will say last year our budget. So that was the first time I was on the budget committee, and the budget historically is partisan, right? Usually the majority party votes for the budget. The minority party doesn't vote for the budget because it has all these different things. It was a bipartisan budget. The budget was balanced. We were able to invest in our values, and we were able to work with Republicans to kind of get it done at the same time. A lot of the energy work that I do is actually bipartisan. Even if they can't talk about climate change the same way that I talk about climate change, they do understand the value of energy independence. They understand the value of clean energy for an economic future, but also for our future as a whole as well. So in Washington State, you'd be shocked at how bipartisan it actually is. In fact, I actually think it's more cordial than even the local levels, candidly. So even though King County and Seattle are technically all Democrats, save a couple of folks, I think it's actually more cordial at the state level, just because part of it is, you know, it's this weird dynamic where you're a part-time legislature. You're only there 2 to 4 months out of the year. It becomes very contentious, and then you go away, and then you come back. I think that perspective actually does help people. Obviously, it makes it very difficult to be a legislator because you don't get paid enough to live in Seattle and be a legislator, so you work like 4 jobs. But I think that there is hope.
So the fact, too, that you're in the majority, I mean, in both houses. So let's face it, that probably makes things, I guess, a bit easier.
My God. It's a lot easier. It's a lot easier too, because even old companies are trying to be more thoughtful, right? Like, I think there's a lot of pressure to be divisive for a variety of reasons. I think when you have division, it's more easy to sell and market for a campaign. You know, working together and being cordial isn't very sexy. It doesn't really sell newspapers. It's not very easy to sell when you go back to campaign. But yes, having the House and the Senate and the governor's office is, in fact, the reason why we're able to get things done. But just to be clear, that doesn't mean that everybody agrees on everything. There's different shades of blue as it comes to kind of how this works. And that's a whole nother episode in itself. But even the dynamics with the House and with the Senate, like they're like 2 separate things.
I was on your website, and I did appreciate the fact that you do have this kind of how-to thing about doing the legislature, what it is.
Yeah.
Because I think so many people today, you know, we don't teach civics anymore, or people don't really understand it. So it's understanding the basics of how do you get a bill through, or what do you got to do?
Yeah.
Which I think is important. We spend more time, it's kind of bitching about things than we do about, okay, how do you make something work?
How do you move it? Yeah. And most of it is actually people agree to. You know what's funny? When I first came in, I definitely had imposter syndrome. So I spent a lot of time preparing and studying and reading and meeting with staff and better understanding how that process worked. And I put together this 13-page document. Effectively, it's a flow chart essentially of how do you pass policy. So there's about 160 steps in order to pass policy. It wasn't just like go through committee and then get a vote and you're done. It was very specific, very nuanced. Then I wrote it in the perspective of a legislator, so it was for me. And a third of those steps, bills can die. So I just noticed where bills potentially died, and I would advocate to be in certain places. So I was on the rules committee in my first year, which is almost unheard of because most new members don't even know what the rules committee is. But when I was doing my research, I said, well, there's 3,000 bills that get introduced. We only pass like 300, and they all die in this one random committee that's not really a committee, and it's called rules. So I wanted to be on that committee, and I was able to advocate to get on there. So I've shared that document. My whole goal is less about how can I advance myself and how can I be successful. It's how you can get other leaders to be successful as well. So I shared that document with every new member, whether they're Republican or Democrat. I share it with advocates. I share it with stakeholders. I share it with anybody who wants it because I think it benefits all of Washington State for us to do a better job at the functions of government, because then we realize, oh, wait, these are the actual problems. Let's just solve these problems instead of just blaming this person who disagrees with us. And really, they don't actually disagree. The reason why I talk to people that I disagree with so much, I would say 80% of the times, it's just a small discrepancy. You fix one thing and they're actually on board. So most of my bills are bipartisan because I tried, and that's usually what it takes.
What is going to be at the top of the list going into, the budget's always at the top of the list, but of issues that you see, and this is a 60-day session?
Yeah, this is going to be a short session. So it's what's called the supplemental. So most of the budget work was done last year. We passed, at least the operating budget was about $69 billion. And what you do is in a supplemental year, you kind of just true up. So depending on how spending has gone, depending on how the economy is doing, you kind of modify it a little bit. So long story short, we actually are going to be able to get more in revenue than we anticipated, which is great, but also the need in our community is higher. So, it balances out to about $2 billion in which we are going to allocate for this next year. A large part of that is going to be around the Climate Commitment Act. So that's the climate policy that we've done in Washington State. It's nation leading around our ability to decarbonize in Washington State. There's obviously an initiative that wants to repeal a whole host of things. Climate policies is one of them. And I totally get it. I think one of the things in which we have to do as legislators, and this to me is the silver lining, is we have to be confident and be able to defend our policies because that's how you know you do a good job. So I'm looking forward to that as we go in. So the biggest things is going to be around climate change and the climate policies that we have in place, making sure that they work well. The budget is a component. Probably the largest component that we'll see is on the behavioral health side. So we've done a lot in terms of trying to build up the infrastructure to alleviate some of the issues that we're seeing in our communities. So when we talk about homelessness, when we talk about addiction, we talk about substance use, a lot of that boils down to not having the proper infrastructure to keep people stable and safe. So everything from behavioral health, ensuring workers have what they need, more support for affordable housing is going to be very important. And you had mentioned public safety earlier. Obviously, there might be an initiative that's happening. One thing that I think is going to move the needle for public safety that everybody agrees to, and it's going to be transformational, but it will make very little headlines. People don't know that if you want to become a law enforcement official, you have to move to Burien, which is in my district, for about 6 months to do the training at the CJTC, it's the Criminal Justice Training Center. So if you lived in Yakima or Wapato or Spokane, you got to move to Burien, leave your family, leave your communities to train to be a law enforcement official. That is not tenable for a lot of folks. So we funded and we've opened up training facilities across Washington State, one in Central Washington, and we have other ones that are opening up right now. If you look at the first class of the folks coming through those facilities, they have names that reflect the communities that they're in, right? Like you see more diversity, you see more folks from that area. That's actually how you get better public safety and law enforcement officials who see themselves as part of the communities. So long story short, I think that's a tremendous thing that we did as a legislature that nobody's going to ever talk about.
I didn't know that.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because you're right.
No.
It's almost like going to college. You got to find a place to live.
Yeah. So that was probably one of the biggest bottlenecks. The number two bottleneck, we're on public safety, So you go through this training program, you leave your family, you go through this training program, you do all the training, you pass all the tests, you have to have a psychological review. One person was doing that. An old white guy was doing that. And for some reason, he kept supporting certain folks and not supporting other folks. So
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, right. So we noticed that, and then we changed that process so it wasn't just held up by one person. So now you have well-trained individuals from the communities in a process that actually can get them through the entire thing. So folks kept saying like, oh, well, Seattle can't recruit because of X, Y, Z. No, they can't recruit because nobody's going to come to Burien to become a law enforcement official and then take up a tougher position. You might as well, go somewhere else. So our whole point is that we want more good people in the right places. We want to support them in a way that actually lives to our values, but also builds a more systemic, equitable kind of process as well.
Well, and that makes so much sense. I mean, that's really great to hear, because generally you just hear rhetoric, but this is actually concrete stuff.
Yeah. Where in Central Washington did they open the other facility?
I can get you the specific address. It's nearby the Tri-Cities, but I'm not exactly sure the specific address.
All right.
Yeah. It's Tri-Cities. I don't know that. I think it's Richland.
Yeah.
We'll double check.
Yeah, that'd be interesting if it was in Wapato. But anyway, it's in the middle of the state. So
middle of the state.
You're right. So the governor he wants more money for climate change, right? So how much of a wrench does that throw things in there?
Actually, no. So climate change is probably the one area we have enough money. Everything else is where it's kind of underfunded. So the way that it works, the controversy that you'll see right now is our Climate Commitment Act just went into effect, right? And for the history of the United States and for the history of Washington State, if you were a polluter, you don't have to pay for your pollution, right? You just emitted pollution. If climate change happened, we had to deal with it. So when there's a wildfire, we had to deal with it. When there's a drought, we had to deal with it, all that stuff. So for the first time in Washington State history, it is no longer free to pollute. And that's what the Climate Commitment Act is. And that program is built in Washington State with the considerations of all the folks who are covered entities as well. So all these folks were able to pollute and then privatize their profits. That's kind of been the paradigm that's always existed. So what's interesting is that this policy went into effect, and then you see kind of the impacts of inflation and everything else as well. And now climate deniers are basically saying, oh, it's climate policy. That's the reason why everything costs so much. Not acknowledging the fact that oil companies made a record $400 billion last year. Not just revenue, that's profit, right? So they've nearly quadrupled their revenue. They've done certain things that were kind of nefarious, I believe, as well. They had stock buybacks, all those different things. So long story short, there is an auction to raise money for mitigation of climate impacts. This is the first time that that's been live. So this is all net new money. So this went from $0 to $2 billion, and that's all new money that we're kind of figuring out. But we want to make sure that we invest that in a way that actually helps Washingtonians. So a lot of that goes,
How do you, what is your defense when people say, well, it's because of this policy that I'm paying over $5 a gallon for gas, when in Mobile, Alabama, they're paying 3 cents a gallon or something? You know? I mean, it's not that ridiculous, but it is significant.
It is significant.
I mean, so what is, in an undemocratic way where we explain it with volumes, what's the bumper sticker? I mean, why is that not true?
Well, so the less bumper sticker is Washington State is being held hostage by oil companies, and we've been held hostage by oil companies for the last 30 years. Our fuel prices have always been one of the highest in all the United States, us, Oregon, and California. That's always been the case. The profit margin in Washington State in terms of profit per gallon is exponentially higher than the rest of the United States. It's because they charge us for it. That's the one thing. And there's only one pipeline that goes down. The other thing that I'll say is it's not going to get cheaper, right? Like if you had to deal with wildfire smoke last year, if you had to deal with droughts, if you had to deal with dirty air in your communities, which we all did, that stuff's not going to get any cheaper. And the cost of fuel isn't going to get any cheaper as well. The United States is pumping out the most amount of fuel ever in the history of its nation. And literally a drug cartel or an oil cartel, OPEC, in the Middle East is the one that's kind of holding it down. So we are being held hostage by oil companies, and they're blaming climate policies for things that we have no control over. And the irony is that fuel costs are actually lower today than they were a year ago. But that's not quite a bumper sticker. I think what I would probably
That's pretty
say,
close.
yeah, but you know what I mean? Like it's frustrating. So I need to call you later to help figure out what this messaging is. But essentially, yes, it is expensive, and it's not going to get any cheaper. The only way for us to loosen this chokehold that we have from the oil companies is to charge them for the pollution that they're actually incurring in our communities, so we can invest that back to free us from this paradigm, to get us more charging infrastructures, to get us more clean energy, to put us on a path forward that actually is going to be sustainable. And less of a bumper sticker, this is more of my talking point. Because we had access to these funds, the government, the feds passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and then they passed the IIJA, the Infrastructure Act, with the Biden administration. We've been able to leverage these dollars to get about $5 or $6 billion to Washington. Most other states are just happy to be having their application in. We're actually able, because of this money, leveraging that in our federal proposals to get money back. So for every dollar we spend in Washington State on climate, we get $5 back from the feds. If that was an investment that somebody, gave to you, you would say yes all day long. And that's kind of what this is. This is an investment in our future. So we aren't at the whims of oil companies going forward.
So the bottom line is, regardless of the climate policy, gas prices were going to get higher.
Oh, yeah. People ask me, this goes away, how much do you think gas prices are going to go down? It won't go down. Like, they've discovered that they can price gouge us, so they are going to keep doing it. And they've been doing it for 30 years. The AG's office has a subcommittee that's been investigating them since the 70s. I have a bill this year. Ever since I started talking about this bill, just talking about the idea of transparency and them having to open up their books, fuel prices have gone down by almost $1, and it's been more stable. I don't know what's going on because it's a global market, but it's suspicious that the moment that there's transparency involved, things become less suspect, right? So I think it's important for us to have transparency in where the cost actually lies. I think climate policies certainly have an impact on fuel costs, but if you think about it, if they're spending $1 billion on climate policies, but then hundreds of billions of dollars on profits, like which one has more of an impact? They could have held prices lower and still made more money than they had ever before.
Couple of things to touch on before we wrap things up here. One thing, in talking to other lawmakers, politicians, the one thing that comes up is the incivility that many public people that are in public service are facing these days. Have you gotten that kind of blowback? Have you got anybody come to your house?
Yeah, anybody show up at your house?
Yeah.
For other than
Come on here, Joanne. We want to talk to you. Yeah.
So most of the incivility that I face is online, and a lot of that has to do with my identity. So I think oftentimes being an Asian person in politics is a little bit different. When I was doing stuff around providing more equity and access for communities, that's when I saw, that rhetoric kind of happen. Yeah, it is difficult, right? Like going on Twitter is difficult. Having cordial conversations is difficult. It's funny when you talk to people in person, it's not that crazy. But yeah, we get, I have to make conscious decisions around which media outlets that I go on, because if I go on, a conservative one, I generally get hate mail for a week afterwards, and it's pretty vicious stuff, but my staff has to review it, not me. So what I end up doing is I just kind of weigh the pros and cons of what I say to make sure that, I'm doing right by my staff. But it's also how you can tell that you're doing a good job is if folks who are, anti-women are mad at you, I'm like, I'm probably doing the right thing, right? If folks who are climate deniers are mad at me, it's like, I'm probably doing the right thing, because if I'm not pushing hard enough, you're not getting stuff done.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, so a couple of years ago, you ran for King County Executive. You didn't win. So what are you looking at doing down the road here besides, or do you want to just stay in the Senate?
So what's funny is that I care very little about being an elected official. I care more about the outcomes associated with it. And the things that I do are less about how I can position myself in the future and more about how we can ensure that we get the right resources in the right place. So even that race, obviously it was audacious. I knew that that was going to be a tough one. We got closer than I think what anybody is expecting. 46% in a race where your opponent spends 3.1 million to your 180,000, I think is interesting. But what's funny in that race, I sat down with some stakeholders in the community, and there was like a bullet point list. There was like 16 things that we thought were not great at the county level, and we felt was because of the current leadership. I campaigned on those 16 things, and the funny thing is, all of a sudden, those 16 things became the top priority for the executive at that time, and a lot of that stuff was able to get done. I've never seen so much investments before in Skyway or White Center. I've never seen such a passion to alleviate some issues around our juvenile justice communities. I've never seen so much interest in supporting our homelessness and nonprofit services. So victory to me looks like a lot of different things. And I have the privilege of being in a space where this is not my identity. Being a senator is something that I do, and I'm very passionate about serving, but that is not the goal. The goal is the outcomes. And sometimes you got to push a little. And that's what we did in my first campaign. We just felt that there was a lot of work that needed to be getting done for our communities, and it wasn't. And now, if you look at the folks who've been elected afterwards, so for me, it was never about one election or me winning an election. It was about everybody else. Gramai Zahalai came after, Sam Cho, Brandon Hersey, Toshiko Hasegawa, all these different folks who should have been in office from the get-go, but didn't get that chance. Now that there was kind of this path that Matt Kennedy helped build. So that's what I care about the most. In terms of next seats, I don't know. You know, my wife probably would rather have me be at home in a quiet job where I can hang out with the kids a bit more, but I do like the work.
But you won't pass anything at home, so you know.
Yeah, exactly.
She'll veto you on everything.
Yeah, so she's right. Yeah, there is no democracy at home. She is in charge.
Yeah. All right, State Senator Joe Nguyen. So, you know, I know you're going to be really busy here over the next 60 days once the session gets going, but maybe at a halfway point we could talk to you about how things are going down there and see what's going on at that point in our world. So yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everything that you guys are doing as well.
All right. State Senator Joe Nguyen. All right, take care.
The Chino y Chicano podcast is available on your favorite podcast provider.
You can watch the video version on YouTube, and Converge Media, a leading producer of culturally relevant content in the Pacific Northwest. We'll talk more later.